In 2013, an article surfaced revealing details about an internal initiative at Square Enix called RPG Juku. This article carried the rather sensational title, "Square Enix forces all staff to play Super Mario RPG in order to learn how to make good RPGs again." Developers were given 3 days to complete the game, and then give opinions about its design. They listed the unique battle system, fun minigames, and environments as positives. Reportedly, one employee was fired for saying he liked, quote, "the ease of going from point A to point B on the world map." Indeed, the claims in the article may appear dubious, and that's because they are. This article was written as a joke. It was initially published on a satirical gaming website, p4rgaming.com. Regardless of whether this article is truth or fiction, it reminds us of an ostensibly better time in the good old days of gaming. If this article resonates with you, then you may feel as if the RPG genre and its major developers have stumbled in recent times, but you can still remember fondly the feeling of being immersed in a great RPG in childhood. For me, Super Mario RPG is that game, one so flawless, immersive, and self-assured that it remains my favorite RPG of all time. What is it about the game's storytelling, mechanical design, and level design that continues to charm the cold, calloused hearts of gamers, even 20 years after its release? In this multi-part analysis, we'll take a close look at the major elements of Super Mario RPG's game design. We'll piece together exactly what earned the game its universal praise upon release, as well as the heartfelt love that the game's fans still hold strongly today. This is part 1 of the analysis, and fittingly, we're going to first talk about the most prominent aspect of the game, its battle system. In my eyes, the beauty of Mario RPG's battle system is that it incorporates the action elements we recognize from past Mario titles while still retaining the flow and feel of traditional RPG battles. The crowning achievement here is the timed hits mechanic, as described by the game's co-director. That was very much inspired by a children's toy that was available in Japan at the time. It was like a large laptop with these buttons that would play music. You had to press the buttons with good timing to the music. It was that idea, having gameplay built around timing button presses, that inspired me to hybridize these two genres of game, to get a little bit of action and RPG into the same game. The timed hits mechanic keeps the player engaged in every single phase of a fight. To produce a timed hit, you have to watch your character's attack animation and press a face button at exactly the right moment. A successful timed hit, depending on how well you timed it, can deal either 1.5 or 2 times your base attack damage. In other words, timed hits allow you to deal double damage with physical attacks. Tying character animation to a fundamental game mechanic like timed hits is immersive, because Mario's hammer swing is no longer just eye candy. It's a miniature puzzle that you have to figure out and respond to each time you attack, and it's immensely satisfying to see and hear a successful timed hit deal damage. Furthermore, each weapon's timing is unique, so the longer you stick with a weapon, the better you'll be at perfecting your timed hits. Of course, you'll also want to upgrade your weapons periodically, which creates a whole new set of timing puzzles for you to solve. And here's the real genius of timed hits. As you get better at controlling your attacks, you're rewarded in real time with increased combat ability. Unlike traditional RPGs, your potential damage is not hard-coded by your strength or weapon stat, or by the number of levels you have. If you perform well in combat, you'll deal up to double damage, so you have to make every hit count. And since each of the game's 31 weapons has a unique animation, they'll each have a unique timing window to perform timed hits. Furthermore, each weapon has a hidden weapon coefficient that adds some randomness to the final damage value. The lazy shell, often considered the best weapon in the game, will sometimes deal amazing damage while other times falling flat. This is because the lazy shell's damage calculation has the highest randomness coefficient of any weapon. For example, if Mario has 100 attack power, the damage the lazy shell can do is equal to 100 for Mario's attack power, plus 90 for the lazy shell's power, plus a random number between -40 and 40 added for randomness. Enemy defenses are subtracted from this sum. Finally, the result is multiplied by 1.5 or by 2 if you did a timed hit, or by 1 if you didn't do a timed hit. But it's not just physical attacks that can be timed. Magic follows its own special rules for timed hits, and these rules are much more complex and varied. For example, Mario's Ultra Jump can be timed to chain jumps indefinitely, but for each jump you can successfully chain, the timing gets tighter and tighter until you have precisely 2 frames, or 1/30th of a second, to nail a jump. If you're really great at this, you can defeat some bosses in a single Ultra Jump. And if you can imagine 100 consecutive Super Jumps, you'll unlock the best armor in the game, but suffice it to say the majority of players, myself included, will forego the attempt because, geez, it's hard. You might think that weaker spells become obsolete as you level, but this isn't always true. Mario's starting special attack, Jump, costs only 3 FP, this game's version of magic points, but for every 2 uses, 1 point of magic power is permanently added to the attack. The observant player may notice this trend and capitalize on Jump's behavior. This means that Mario's starting spell and his signature move can become the strongest special attack in the game, reaching a maximum of 150 magic power. For comparison, the next highest magic power spell in the game is Ultra Jump at 65. Neither Super Jump nor Ultra Jump benefit from this hidden modifier, and likewise, both of these abilities have their own unique benefits over Jump. There is very little true obsolescence here, which prevents the feeling of just walking on a stats treadmill to keep up with enemy power. Most of Bowser's magic attacks require the player to rotate the D-pad, which is heck on your fingers, but can add 4 full rotations worth of damage to a spell. Timed hits also affect healing spells, like Toadstool's Group Hug, which means that a well-timed heal can mean the difference between victory and defeat. If you use Toadstool's revival spell, Come Back, without timing, the target character will revive with less than full HP. However, correctly time the spell, and the character will be fully healed. The implication here is that if you're awesome at timed hits, you might just let Mallow die so that you can resurrect him next turn with full HP. I mean, he's not really pulling his weight here, you know what I'm saying? Geno Whirl, a level 11 spell, has a special override in its calculation. There's no in-game indication that this attack can be timed, but if you do correctly time it, any non-boss enemy will instantly take 9,999 damage and be KO'd. If you miss the timing, you'll do an unimpressive amount of damage for the higher FP cost, which might just clue you in that the ability's timing even exists. Now so far we've only talked about timed hits with regard to your attacks, but enemy attacks can also be blocked with correct timing. A correctly timed, but not perfectly timed block will result in taking half damage. That's where it gets really interesting though. If you do perfectly time your block, you'll reduce the damage of any blockable attack to 0. In other words, if you perform well in battle, you can negate all blockable attacks. Even if you're underleveled, even if you're fighting Culex, even if you're on the verge of death, you still have the power to pull through by skillful blocking. Think about the tension you'll feel watching an enemy wind up for a potentially lethal attack. If Mario is going to die from the next hit, your eyes are going to be glued to the screen. Succeed, and you'll survive another round and have a chance to heal up. This is especially true in the earlier sections of the game, where your HP pool is relatively low and you can be defeated by just 2 or 3 unblocked attacks. This is crucial in showing the player that learning how to block hits is going to be a really important recurring mechanic. Note that this doesn't count for spells like Flame Wall, and certain physical attacks cannot be blocked, which kinda makes sense. I mean, you can block a punch, but not a wall of fire, so yeah. You can also choose to defend during your turn, which will somewhat reduce incoming damage, but if you defend and also correctly time a block, your incoming damage is even more significantly reduced. Most of the time, you'll opt not to defend though, since you're going to miss some of the opportunities you have to attack, and there's a really good chance you can mitigate some of that damage anyway by skillful blocking. Consider the effect of timed hits on the flow of combat. In other RPGs, you might tell your characters to fight, then you sit back while the animation plays out. If the enemy attacks you, you again just sit back and watch while the numbers tick up or down. In Mario RPG, your fingers must always be ready to correctly time your own attacks, as well as defend from enemy attacks. However, if you need some time to think, Mario RPG gives you as much time as you need, because action is halted while you take your turn. Amazingly, timed hits don't completely unseat the game's balance. If you're good with timed hits, you'll certainly do better, and because each weapon and spell has a unique timing, you'll naturally be better at some than others. In fact, we said above that timed hits deal double damage, but you can look at it from a different point of view. A non-timed hit deals only half damage, while a successfully timed attack will deal normal damage. There's no point in ignoring timed hits, so encounters are tuned upwards towards frequent successful timed hits and blocks. Imagine if you could summon Knights of the Round in Final Fantasy VII and increase your damage by timing the button presses for each attack. Final Fantasy VIII actually included a very simple timed hits mechanic, but only for Squall, the game's main character, and only for his physical attacks on the enemy. Timed hits do an excellent job of reinforcing the flow of combat. You'll notice very quickly how effective timed hits are, and you'll look forward to every fight as a chance to get better. You'll discover that every animation matters, whether attacking, casting a spell, or defending, and every animation is a puzzle challenging you to solve it. In my opinion, timed hits are the single most important factor in keeping battles fresh, fun, and exciting all the way to the end. Instead of each enemy just being a pile of numbers and stats, there's now a tangible difference between enemy types and their attacks. Instead of a weapon upgrade just being a slightly higher number, it's now a new combat challenge for you to master, and each new enemy provides a new chance for you to practice. I guess all I'm trying to say is that timed hits provide interactivity that most RPGs with turn-based battle systems don't attempt to provide. And because the system is fully fleshed out and unique for every weapon and attack, the flow of combat is constantly refreshed as you encounter new scenarios. Super Mario RPG does away with a lot of the traditional mundanities of RPGs. Magic points, called FP for flower points, are now shared by the entire party. Essentially, the only important stat to track moment to moment are your character's HP, rather than having each character use a separate magic pool. While it's objectively less complex than having a dedicated MP pool per character, it does force the player to carefully choose which spells they use. If you blow through your FP on fireballs and jumps, you might not have enough next turn to heal at a critical moment. Luckily, items that restore FP are plentiful, so the only downside to using lots of magic is that one character will have to sacrifice a turn to use an item to restore your FP. I usually make it Mallow because, he's not really pulling his weight around here. The battle interface is fantastically streamlined, and by and large, menus are gone and replaced by 4 different nodes that correspond to the SNES face buttons. The X button will always bring up items, the A button will always prepare a physical attack, and so on. Battle controls never get more complex than this, and the turn-based combat lets you carefully choose your actions in every fight. The HUD is understated and really helps the battle environments shine. In a game where you need to nail your timing a few times per combat round, it really helps to avoid distractions on the HUD. Not to mention these battle environments are beautiful. I want to mention the shell minigame that sometimes occurs after battles. If you manage to spawn a lucky flower after defeating an enemy, you can choose to go double or nothing with your experience points and gold. Maybe it's just me, but I've never been able to track these shells with my eyes. They're just so freaking fast. But statistically, it's always to your benefit to attempt it. 66% of the time, you'll either break even or double your rewards, while only 33% of the time you'll lose. We'll talk more about minigames in a future installment of this analysis. But besides the lucky flower, there are flowers which will instantly heal you, give you an immediate free turn, or temporarily boost your attack or defense. Lastly, I want to touch on RNG, randomness. By and large, Super Mario RPG's battle mechanics incorporate randomness in all the right ways. It's usually really difficult to use randomness in a way that doesn't feel cheap or aggravating to the player because it requires balancing to account for almost every possible scenario. Furthermore, randomness in Mario RPG is almost always either beneficial or neutral, and never just malicious. An example of neutral randomness is that each attack can randomly subtract X damage during its calculation, but this is balanced by an equal chance to add that same amount of damage to the final number. The majority of each attack's damage is still determined by your ability to time and block hits, though. An example of only beneficial randomness is that there is also a random chance that any item used in battle will not be consumed upon use, indicated by the message, "Get a freebie." Again, this is only beneficial, so you're happy when it happens, but not sad when it doesn't. Check out our analysis on randomness in games for more information about why using randomness skillfully is not always as easy as it looks. I hope you enjoyed this overview of Super Mario RPG's battle mechanics. Thank you for your continued support of GameSoup. In this installment of our analysis of Super Mario RPG, we'll take a look at level design. Level design is usually most important in side-scroller or 3D platformers, and less so in traditional JRPGs, but Mario RPG's unique gameplay leaves a lot of room for some really interesting ideas. In a broad sense, the game's success comes from its skillful blending of RPG and platformer elements in a cohesive package, and we can better understand the game's triumphs by examining how its levels are crafted. Let's start with a thought experiment. Pretend you're the director of Super Mario RPG, and you're brainstorming about what kind of game you could make. You want it to feel like a Mario game, so you know you'll need lots of Goombas, question blocks, power-ups, and of course jumping. If you go with the isometric perspective, you'll have to integrate all of these assets into 3 dimensions. What if we try to make a simple level using these concepts? Well, you'd probably end up with something like Mushroom Way, the first real dangerous area of the game. Look how simple the layout is. Visually, it meanders back and forth, but in reality, it's completely linear. There are question blocks in plain sight, and most enemies are visible on screen, although the perspective means that enemies can wait in ambush out of the player's view. Jumping is fun and responsive, and you'll probably experiment with all the controls in the first area. The next screen requires you to jump, but it eases you in by only requiring you to time the jump, not direct it. There's no penalty yet for imprecise jumps, but there is a very obvious goal as well as the means to achieve the goal. Compare this to a similar jump in the second area, Bandit's Way, where a mistimed jump will land you into a group of enemies who always walk towards Mario. At this point, we have a lot of the concepts from traditional Mario games, and we've also added some of our own ideas. If you were to flatten out this area onto a piece of paper, it would more or less resemble a familiar Mario stage. You might ask, why is this so important? In general, good level design gives a short-term goal to the player and makes it fun to achieve that goal. Jump on the Goomba, hit this block, collect those coins. All the important short-term goals remain intact and recognizable. Get to the end, hit this block, beat those Goombas up. This is crucial in giving the game a Mario feel, rather than some unrelated RPG with Mario characters pasted on top. The level design makes it feel familiar, but the perspective makes it unique. Good level design will subtly teach the player all they need to know through oral and visual hints, such as colors, contrast, architecture, audio cues, item and enemy placements, and more. Here's another way classic Mario concepts are translated into an RPG space. This area looks almost identical to the last area in Bandit Way, except there's a question block up here that requires platforming. If you go for it, you'll discover an invincibility star. In a freak accident that doesn't occur anywhere else in the game, the enemies here are suddenly attracted to you now that you can one-shot them. More will continue to flood the screen as long as you're invincible, and you'll always gain a level here as a result, which shows you that invincibility stars are essentially free passes to winning battles. I really love how the use of stars here is explained to the player purely through the developer anticipating what the player will do as they experience this scenario for the first time. Since stars are so rare in the game, you'll always be cautious when you hit a question block. You never know when you'll suddenly stumble onto one and have to make a mad dash around the area killing enemies. It's an important part of the reward system of the game, and it helps draw the player into being more excited to hit treasure blocks and see what's inside. Even though there's a lot to do in them, most of the game's dungeons are only a few screens long. The developers avoid frequently reusing assets or designing needlessly repetitive dungeons, which I think is a way of keeping the gameplay interesting and fluid. Karo Sewers, despite being only a handful of screens, still contains a lot of pipes that can easily disorient you. To give you some help here, the designers fill you in on how to use pipes with a short written tutorial when you first enter the area. Here you're required to jump up and down to different heights, but a mistimed jump will often get you into battle or set you back a few seconds. You'll also be using warp pipes here and throughout the rest of the game, which functionally are exactly the same as in 2D Mario games, but the transition to 3D spaces forces the developers to figure out a way to have Mario enter pipes of 3 dimensions using a D-pad meant for controlling in 2 dimensions. As a result, sometimes you'll have to jump again on top of the pipe to reset your position in order to enter it. It seems a little unintuitive at first that pressing down in a 3D space should make you enter a pipe instead of move south, but this makes the instructions at the beginning of the dungeon all the more useful. We're going to skip around a bit here and look at the Pipe Vault, an optional area. Just like Mushroom Way and Bandit Way, it's reminiscent of the levels in the original Super Mario Bros. Games, namely the underground sections, but it also includes a unique control mechanic that's never used again. When you approach this block, you'll notice a coin underneath, but Mario is physically unable to reach it. It turns out that, quite unintuitively, the solution is to run towards the block. Note that you're running northeast here, so you're holding up and right on the D-pad. And when you're close, pressing down on the D-pad will make Mario duck and slide under the block. This element is so out of place that it harkens back to our discussions in previous longforms on artificial difficulty. Not only is there no way to otherwise duck or slide in the game, but the player is expected to move the D-pad in the exact opposite direction he's running. It's an excellent Easter egg though, and I'm always happy to see these one-off mechanics being used in creative ways, but I very much doubt that most people would come to the logical conclusion that you should be able to duck here and nowhere else in the game. This is one of those examples of a strict adherence to the 2D Mario formula that doesn't really translate perfectly to a 3D space. And it may have been better to leave the sliding mechanic out altogether here, but looking at the Pipe Vault as a whole, it's basically a linear path, narrow enough that you have to deal strategically with avoiding enemies or else fight them. Again, try laying this level flat on a piece of paper to see how well it matches up with what you know to be a classic Mario type of level design. You'll see it retains much of the familiarity of traditional Mario titles, and the remix of the Mario Bros. Underground theme is another way to instill that familiarity here. The above examples were rather simple in their execution, creating 3D spaces without straying too far from what fans expect of a Mario title. I want to put them somewhere in the middle of a spectrum of how well 2D Mario is implemented in 3D. To give you an idea of what I'm considering to be at the extreme ends of this spectrum, let's look at Booster Tower and Star Hill. Booster Tower is my favorite area of the game in terms of level design, art style, and even music. So far in the game, we've stuck pretty close to RPG cliches. The forest maze that spits you back out at the entrance, the castle town, the sewers. Booster Tower is unlike any RPG cliche in the book in just how weird it is. Its level design is at once disorienting and memorable, and everything about it reminds you of how insane Booster is. The checkerboard pattern on the ground, the enemies who engage you in conversation before jumping into battle with you, the train that Booster rides around to greet you, the Booster lineage portraits, and so on. And of course, we have to mention the transformation room. It almost feels like some crazy dream all the way through, and it certainly doesn't help that Booster himself looks so unusual. If you could summarize Mario RPG's gameplay and tone with a single area, this would be my pick. Booster Tower's layout is so dense that you can't lay it on a piece of paper. It really takes advantage of all 3 dimensions as you progress through it, but it still feels familiar. Booster's Tower is aptly named because you're mostly ascending vertically, which in any other RPG would be nearly impossible to portray visually as well as Super Mario RPG does. It also means plenty of really fun platforming and traps. There are a few cases where, once again, the isometric perspective can sabotage your jumps. In particular, jumping for this weapon requires that you land on the seesaw below, but with very little visual aid in doing so, you might need to do it a few times. This room has hidden spots on the floor that summon enemies, but you can use these coins to try and guide yourself through. On the way back though, You probably won't have saved enough coins to avoid a fight, but if you paid attention, you can still remember where to jump. So that's Booster Tower. On the other end of our spectrum, we have Star Hill. Star Hill is underwhelming. Let me explain. Star Hill is an excellent example of average or even poor level design. There's nothing terribly wrong with it exactly, but it's unremarkable in every way. It's 3 screens. All of them are roughly flat and shapeless. There are no blocks, there is no platforming, there is only blue. Tag all the flowers, walk in the door. Tag all the flowers, walk in the door. What about short-term goals? What about hitting blocks, jumping up to platforms? The enemies here patrol at high speeds and with unpredictable paths, so you're likely to be ambushed even if you're trying to avoid a fight. Have you ever gotten stuck in another RPG, perhaps in a large dungeon, and while you're trying to figure out where to go, you're constantly being interrupted by random encounters that disrupt your focus? This sort of feels like a miniature version of that, running around looking for all the flowers on each screen. At the end, you'll stumble upon one of the 7 stars, but this one's given to you without a fight, and indeed, without any stakes at all. Considering how all the other stars in the game are preempted by a significant battle challenge, I never quite understood why this star is just casually given to you. The cynic in me thinks of rushed development, but this isn't a feeling I get anywhere else in the game, so I don't think that's the case. You could argue that this is more of a story area because of all the wishes you can stop and read along the way, including Luigi's and Mallow's. Star Hill isn't a bad area at all. It's perfectly passable, but when the rest of the game emphasizes exploration, battles, and platforming so heavily, it feels really out of place. One way to make this area more interesting would be to cut battles out entirely and make the area strictly a platforming or puzzle challenge, either to give you a break from combat or to emphasize the importance of where you are. An improved Star Hill would include some singular mechanical focus that reinforces the core gameplay. What about an even simpler way to fix Star Hill? 1. Have Frog Fuchsius just give you the star when you talk to him. Oh, look what washed up in the pond this morning. Take this star and go to Seaside Town. This achieves the same goal as Star Hill by taking Star Hill out of the game entirely. Second, Star Hill could also have hills, that would be nice. When you hear the name, you probably expect to see, a hill or two? Am I being too picky here? We've already seen some great examples of quality level design in the first half of the game, and we'll see that the rest of the game holds lots of great levels for us to explore. Stay tuned for the second half of this analysis, when we'll finish out the game and tie it all together. In this installment of our analysis on Super Mario RPG's level design, we'll start with Seaside Town and go all the way to the end of the game. Seaside Town is where I consider the dividing line between the lighter first half of the game and the more intense second half. The sunken ship in particular can be a really tough go the first time. This area relies on a password challenge. You can get 6 hints for the password, each of which is hidden behind a battle and a unique puzzle. This password is always the same, so if you're on your second playthrough, you can skip 6 rooms and 6 battles in here, making it a pretty straightforward dungeon. This is still one of the largest areas in the game though, and you'll discover how mentally taxing it can be once you try to get to the third clue and enter the dreaded 3D maze. In all fairness, the concept of a 3D maze in an isometric world is a great one. This is one of those few places where the game breaks the fourth wall by giving you an out if you're stuck. The open areas are a nice touch for providing some perspective, but I always had trouble with the area, and looking at the solution, I'm surprised my younger self ever figured this out. Luckily, it's totally optional, and again, you really only have to do it the first time you play the game, since the password doesn't change. None of the other puzzle rooms are nearly as challenging as the maze. Now it's time to enter the password. If you have all the clues, you'll still have to think about it a little bit, because the word is scrambled. The answer is pearls, by the way. After one more boss fight and a few more battle rooms, you'll fight Johnny for the next star piece. Now I want to skip forward a little bit to Monster Town, where the game's hidden super boss Culex can be challenged. Super bosses are typically hidden away in RPGs, and Culex is likewise waiting for you behind this sealed door. Opening the door is actually quite cryptic. You need to buy a seemingly useless shiny stone from Moleville, but the vendor doesn't appear until after you've gone through the coal mines. At first glance, this item appears to be useless, and there's nothing in the game that explicitly contradicts this, but if you kept it in your inventory between Moleville and Monster Town, you can use it to unlock the door. You can actually sell the stone for 2 coins, which is a low enough price that you probably won't sell it. The low selling price is a tactic used in other RPGs as well, and it's a way to subtly discourage you from getting rid of the shiny stone, increasing your chances of having your mind blown when you open this door. There's yet another unique one-time mechanic here in Monster Town. You can see this key up on the ledge, but there's no way to access it. If you go to the house below, you can talk to the Thwomp, who will always do this. If you do it a few times, which is hinted at by the Thwomp's several lines of unique dialogue, you'll knock the key down outside to access Belom's treasure room. Even if you didn't intend to knock the key down, talking to this Thwomp twice will catch you off guard, because most NPCs only have a single line of dialogue at any given time. This is a great way to introduce this new mechanic so late in the game. The developers have thrown in an out-of-place element at a point where most players believe they've figured out the rules of the in-game universe. Monster Town is already one huge example of throwing something unexpected at the player, so the falling key mechanic kind of blends right in and feels like a natural addition to me. Bean Valley requires some vine climbing, which is made easier due to the straightforward placement of the vines along the isometric axis. It's very important that the depth between vines is clear here, to avoid adding artificial difficulty and player frustration with the jumps. And since the vines are so tall, you won't really be able to rely on shadows here to correct your jumps. You'll also grab a seed, which has no use yet, but we'll come back to that soon. Nimbus Land is a fun, if unremarkable area. It's clever that some of the statues will come to life to attack you just the same way that you pretended to be a statue in order to enter the castle. There's also this completely invisible path that leads to a frog coin, but it actually serves a hugely important function for getting the lazy shell. As far as I know, this path on the Nimbus Land map is the only other invisible platform in the game, and you're unlikely to find it unless you're actively exploring every possible inch of the area. This is why the invisible path inside the castle can be useful in setting the precedent that such other paths might exist, which just might lead you to discover how to get the ingredients for the lazy shell. Let's jump to the barrel volcano, which should remind you of the bridge spanning the game's very first area. But now you can fall in the lava, so this is a serious step up in difficulty. Hopefully you practiced on the donut bridge in Land's End, because the jumps here can be pretty tricky, especially if you want to grab the treasure lying around. There are a lot of enemy encounters here, and most of them are pretty tough. By this point, you should be doing well with timed hits and blocks, so the difficulty increase should be apparent to you, but also manageable. As you go to nab the Power Star, it'll be snatched away by the Axum Rangers, and you'll begin an ascent to the top of the volcano to fight them. Even though you can't actually fail this chase segment, the music and tension of the situation make it exciting to play. This is a great thing, because if you could actually fail this section and be forced back to the last save point, all the excitement this scene elicits would be replaced by frustration. Now we arrive at the final area of the game. This is the Gauntlet. Consecutive battles, super challenging platforming, and some fairly tricky puzzles await us here. Even worse, the numbered doors are randomly connected to the challenges, so you'll have to be ready for anything, even if it's not your first time through. This Gauntlet is a great way to top off the experiences you've had so far, because it focuses on the three primary aspects of the game: platforming, fighting, and puzzles. You might have serious problems judging your jumps here in the platforming sections, due to the many moving blocks. Just past this area, you'll also find the infinite coin block before venturing into the final dungeon, the factory. I never stopped to think about it before, but I almost wish that Exor were the game's final boss. I mean, he's one of the most iconic parts of the game's storytelling, but he really only guards the final dungeon. Conversely, we haven't even seen Smithy, which might seem like an unusual way to present your game's major antagonist. But the more I thought about why this is, the more I started to appreciate not showing Smithy until the final battle. You've been fighting Smithy's creations throughout the entire game, but you have no idea what to expect when you confront him. You don't know what he looks like, or even what he is, but by defeating all of Smithy's creations, you feel like you've grown strong enough to be worthy of confronting him. At the same time, many other characters are aware of Smithy's existence, but we as the player are in the dark. This generates a fear of the unknown that can hang over you, kind of like how nobody in the Harry Potter universe will say the name Voldemort. The images and ideas in our minds are usually much more frightening than the reality, and this tension makes Smithy seem even more menacing. The factory is awesome. It's longer than most of the other dungeons, and the unusual color-muted aesthetic really clashes with the rest of the game and makes it feel appropriately otherworldly. The whole thing feels at once utilitarian like a factory should feel, and unnerving like a final dungeon should feel. Conveyor belts and nuts and bolts scattered around are really clever ways of integrating the level's theme into the platforming. The industrial soundtrack also does a great job of supporting the unsettling imagery, all leading up to the final battle. In general, Mario RPG's level design is at its strongest in areas that rely on verticality. Let me clarify that. Safe verticality. If missing a jump means getting sent back a screen or having to do a section over, that's the kind of frustration we want to avoid. But here's the prime example of safe verticality. Booster Tower has a lot of staircases that you can't fall off of, and only a few jumps where an error will send you back. This is isometric platforming done right. But in areas like the final Gauntlet platforming sections, it can be a little frustrating to jump between moving blocks with very little for your eyes to anchor your position to. It's sort of like playing a beat 'em up and going to attack the enemy, only to realize you're just a few pixels higher and thus on a completely different horizontal plane. You might very well mess up the platforming sections because you can't rely on your shadow, and missing a jump means going back to the beginning, which is discouraging when you feel like there's little you can do to prevent it. The enemy density is also erratic at times, which can interrupt your jolly good time jumping around. In areas like the sunken ship, it's nearly impossible to avoid consecutive fights, simply because the rooms are narrow and the enemy sprites are large. Furthermore, enemies have idle animations and may patrol a certain area, and they may have a chase behavior once you've gotten close enough. I still vastly prefer this method over random encounters because it helps the environments come to life, and because it avoids that disruption of focus we mentioned in the last analysis with Star Hill. Enemies will ambush you from unseen hiding places, or may not even notice you if you proceed carefully. Most importantly, this is the developers handing control over to you, the player, over how you encounter enemies, giving you time to heal up or make party changes before your next fight. Now that we've covered all the game's areas, our level design talk is over. The next installment of this analysis will focus on how the game's level design impacts its progression system, namely leveling up, getting more powerful weapons, and how Mario RPG uses these mechanics in unique and interesting ways. In this installment of our analysis of Super Mario RPG, we'll focus on how the game's level design impacts its progression system, namely leveling up and becoming more powerful. I want to first touch on Stat Squish. There is a huge stat squish in Mario RPG, which is a direct consequence of the game's level design. Mario RPG has a level cap of 30, which differentiates it from most other RPGs, which typically use 99 or 100 as the cap. I believe this limit is a result of the relatively short length of the game. In my opinion, the short length of the game is simply a result of its content being all killer, no filler. Most dungeons are only a handful of screens, there's no overworld travel, and a relatively lighthearted story negates the need for lengthy dialogue or exposition. It would be impractical to use a cap of level 100, since every level up requires manual input from the player to select a stat bonus. The takeaway here is that the stat squish is probably a direct result of the very short length of the game. This brevity also affects your stats in other interesting ways. Consider that the max HP is only 255. This is just 30% of that in Chrono Trigger, and less than 3% of the HP limit in most Final Fantasy games. But you'll really only reach this number if you grind to level 30, which most people won't do. In fact, on a normal playthrough, you'll get to somewhere between level 17 and 22 when you beat the final boss. You'll also learn your most powerful magic spells at level 18, so there's even less incentive to grind past this point. But this actually makes perfect sense in the context of RPGs. For some simple math, let's round the levels of the average player experience to a nice even 20. Take note that you end up at roughly 66% of the level cap by the end of the game. In many other RPGs, you usually don't reach the level cap by the end. In my experience, you typically get around level 50 or 60. And if we go ahead and round this number out very roughly as we did above, we'll see that you're still about 2/3 of the way to the level cap. In both cases, there's still plenty of room for the natural variations in leveling due to player preference, but you'll need to grind up towards the level cap for extra challenging encounters, like the Culex fight we mentioned in our last installment. Again, due to the short length of the game, a cap of 30 is more than adequate. All this math, though, leads us to an interesting conclusion. Since Mario RPG's level cap is squished down to 1/3 of a typical RPG, you might imagine that you actually gain 3 levels every time you level up. Of course, this is also based on an arbitrary level 100 cap, but this makes each level up more meaningful. Adding 1 level to all your characters can make an area immensely less challenging. You can imagine how the pacing of the game would break if the level cap were 100, and you gain levels 3 times as fast as you already do. So despite my natural aversion to such a low level cap, it actually just streamlines the player experience by squishing down the numbers. A more recent title, Pillars of Eternity, had a level cap of 12 on launch, but it threw more skills and abilities in my face than I knew what to do with. Gaining levels in that game makes even more of a difference. The stat squish in Mario RPG actually has its own consequences on gameplay. It draws the focus away from role-playing and more towards action platforming. The developers avoid drowning the player in all kinds of secondary stats and numbers that might overwhelm a first-time RPG player, but timed hits and platforming can be understood by the player regardless of their age. And since there is such a heavy focus on these elements, the target audience for the game is larger than most traditional RPGs. Of course, this stat squish down to 30 levels also makes it really easy to take advantage of certain exploits. If you get a game over, enemies are reset, but you still keep all the experience you've earned. Again, streamlining. In a 6 to 8 hour game, having to redo its stretch because you forgot to save might be maddening. Anyway, the exploit here is that in Land's End, you can use an invincibility star over and over to quickly reach the level cap. Once you use it, you can purposely die in battle to be returned to a save point right next to the star, which has respawned. You can do this in a few other areas of the game, including Mushroom Way near the very beginning, and the sunken ship roughly in the middle of the game. The fact that you always retain experience means that not a second of your time is wasted when playing this game. Having sometimes lost a half hour or more of progress in bigger titles like Final Fantasy X, this is a comforting thought for me. It's always important to have repercussions for failure in a game, or else you risk disengaging the player. But at the same time, it's good to soften that blow when you can to help the player's next try be more successful. The stat squish and length of the game also have another interesting effect. Items, weapons, and coins are thrown on you like candy from a piñata from start to finish. You'll constantly find flower tabs to increase your magic pool up to its cap of 99, and almost every town has a whole new set of equipment for all of your characters. There are tons of treasure boxes with coins and items, 40 more treasure boxes that are hidden, and even an infinite coin box near the end of the game to save you from grinding on enemies for money to prepare for the final gauntlet. Because you're always receiving some incremental upgrade, you actually feel like you're progressing all the time, which is a great psychological tool to make the player feel invested in the experience. The takeaway from all this is that Mario RPG does everything it can to keep you progressing no matter what. You have tons of ways to eliminate grinding, tackle bosses, and keep on moving forward. This is a game that respects your time, and it makes sure that the 10 to 15 hours you spend on a playthrough will be the most fun and action-packed hours they can be. Each area is so short that you're never bored of seeing the same scenery. On the contrary, it feels like it's all over too quickly. And I would give piles of money to the Kickstarter project that promises to build a time machine, just so we can go back in time and give the Mario RPG development team 10 times the budget and time to work on this game. And that's it for level design and its effects on stats and progression. So if there's anything we left out that you think deserves mentioning, be sure to tell us in the comments.